down at the QA, place that Keith avoids at all possible costs.
Pediatrics, not QA.
Tries not to. And as I said, I've done some triathlons. And this started with Keith asking me to do something about injuries in kids, what to look for, what's an injury and what's not an injury. And then I realised, sort of quite sort of subtly really, that it had morphed into, I think it ended up as how to keep teenagers happy, didn't it? I think that was in one of the emails. And I realised that it was gradually becoming sort of a slightly more impossible task. Anyway, so I thought, I just to mention, I do a lot of neurology and epilepsy, and so life in my head is all about patterns. And then clearly something about puberty, particularly thinking about coaching kids through puberty, so we'll talk about that. I thought we'd do some specific conditions, look at some of the things that we see and that I see in clinic that cause general problems in some kids, as well as, sort of, if you're looking at sports, they'll cause more problems. And then we talked a bit about, mentioned just a little bit about safeguarding and protection and things. So look at, just mention some red flags, and then as Keith said, and as I said, butt in at any point if you want to ask, or you want to do something different. By all means, just stop and talk a bit about some of the bits we're doing. So I just wanted to mention patterns really, and just say that the whole of what I do is about recognising patterns, normal patterns and abnormal patterns. Sometimes you look quite hard and you can't see them, and life and sport and injuries and all those things, and teenagers are all about patterns of behaviour, patterns of injury, patterns of whatever they're doing. Look for patterns. That was a pattern from one of the ties that one of my sons bought me several years ago. I'm still not allowed to wear it, so it comes out occasionally. Anyway. So yeah, just think, if you think in patterns, it's all right. Sorry, this is showing what's next. So just to think about puberty, just sort of do the medical bit and the sort of bit about puberty really. Anywhere between 8 and 14 is where puberty starts. And actually, if you start looking at hormone surges, they probably start at like 5 or 6. So every now and again, you'll get some really, really stroppy, odd behaviour at that sort of level. There's quite a few people just went, yeah, it's already there. And you see you get those sort of little surges, hormonal surges at night often. And puberty is all about sort of hormonal triggers for everything. And what you get really is you get growth, rapid, massive growth, and growth spurts. So it's not linear, it's all random, or it's all in bits. And it all happens at different rates, and different bits grow at different rates. And that's one of the main problems with when you're thinking about sort of sport and exercise and injuries, is that things growing at different rates, and people are putting different stresses that they're not used to at different rates, so muscles grow at different rates to bone and things, then you can see that you get out of sync and get problems. So growth is not linear, it doesn't go, and it sort of grows in spurts. And the other bit really is brain is really abnormal in teenagers. And if you actually start doing scans of children, we try not to do it, but if we start doing scans in children, you'll see that their brains are physically different, and they do change. And I've got some bits about brain, I think, in a bit, to think about that. So that's sort of vaguely puberty, is the sort of physical bit, and then the psychological bit that we'll talk about in a little bit of time.
Can I ask a question with puberty? I've just heard different things around females. I'm coaching 13 to 19-year-olds, and if they've not reached puberty by 14 and menarche come in, should I be asking to go to the doctor, or is it 16? Because there's this different...
No, girls generally, puberty is earlier in girls than boys, and by sort of 14, you know, if they're not having periods, if they're not menarchal by about 14, then we would probably see them in a clinic.
Thank you.
Okay. And it might be, you know, puberty can be delayed in really high activity sports.
Yeah. But that was my concern with one, because training is so hard and so motivated, and that the parents were dismissing it all the time, and I really wanted to check by the doctor. But they're fine. So thank you.
So just so I know, so presumably for boys it can be later.
Normally it is later in boys.
Yeah.
So pubertal onset in girls, if you start looking at it, is sort of 8 to 9 and 9 to 10 in boys. So pubertal onset and growth is generally later in boys. So you'll see, if you look at classes of ages, you'll see girls get their growth spurts early. And quite a lot of girls will overtake the boys for a start at sort of 9, 10, and then the boys will catch up and they'll take over a bit later. But yeah, so puberty is normally later, a year or two later in boys. Definitely. And over time, it's definitely getting younger as well. Over the last 20, 30 years, it's dropped by 1 to 2 years. Onset. So just think about some of the specific things that people talk about, and Kate mentioned 1 or 2 things when we mentioned this. So certainly things that overuse injuries, these are really common, and they get them in adolescents and teenagers through puberty because of that variable growth. Okay, and they tend to get problems around insertion of tendons and around growth plates. This is an ankle, so this is your foot at the bottom. This is your main tibia. This is a growth plate in the middle, and this is when your tendons inserting on the inside on here. So you can see that that's not complete bone, and that bit there is the growth plate, and so that bit there is where bones grow, and that's a weak bit. So if someone's growing suddenly and their bones grow, or their muscles don't grow and their bones grow a little bit more, you get a little bit of extra stress on here. You can see that where tendons and things insert around growth plates are the sort of places that you're going to get injuries, and that's where the patterns of sort of where things hurt is often quite useful. And overuse injuries are really just an exaggeration of normal training. So you hurt a muscle or you damage it, it then repairs and gets stronger, and things get stronger and better, and that's the idea of training. And actually, if you just exaggerate that and you put extra stress on certain places, you can get injuries, and that's where overuse injuries come in. Okay, you just haven't quite got insufficient time to repair and strengthen, and so what you do effectively is you sort of keep damaging something without it repairing, and then what you tend to get is you'll tend to get where that inserts. We'll look at plantar fasciitis, which is one of the really common ones. So where the actual plantar fascia, which is a fibrous band, inserts at the back, just at the back of your heel, what you get is that's inflamed and it doesn't heal properly, because then you keep injuring it. And actually what you can get in the end is little bits of calcium, so it almost forms like bone, where that tendon or that ligament insert into the bottom, and that's why it really, really hurts. Okay. So plantar fasciitis in particular, and I quite like this picture. So you've got the arch of your foot, and then the plantar fascia is a bit like, it's said to be a bit like a bowstring along the bottom. So that's quite flat and tight, and it's seasonal. So you get it wearing flip-flops and nice shoes and things like that a lot of people wear in summer. They wear flat shoes. And somewhere I was once reading an essential kit for triathlon, and the first thing on the list was recovery sandals, and I've still never found any. So I've no idea what recovery sandals are.
You can just put the message out there: no flip-flops, no sliders. That would just be the brilliant message ever. Please.
You see, but then the part of the talk was how to keep teenagers happy. That's just not going to happen. So you just contradicted it already. So yes, no flip-flops.
Thank you.
It's she's coaching the ones that actually want to be there.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So you see, if you've got that flat band and you flatten that arch out, you're putting extra pressure on that plantar fascia, and that's why you get plantar fasciitis. And it's right at the bottom here, right underneath the heel, which is where it starts, and then it spreads along. And it's just this bit that gets inflamed, and if you keep inflaming it, it will start to form little bits of bone almost in there, and it doesn't heal. And because, unlike your hand or your arm that you can just stop using, you can't stop. Well, they can try and stop walking, can't they? They can sit there, but you can't stop using it. So you have to. That's why resting takes a long time, and that's why a lot of stretching and keeping that arch and keeping stretching is really useful.
Is that stretching of the whole leg, or particularly the foot?
In particular, the foot in plantar fasciitis. If you can see, it's under here, And if you think about some of the others, I'll show you another. I've got the next slide. Hopefully, it's got the pictures on. Oh, 2 slides. It's got the pictures of the other bits on. But yes, it's mainly for the foot for plantar fasciitis. It is that bit of your foot rolling it on frozen bottles and things like that is really useful. There's no evidence that all those physio things, are they about £200 on Amazon?
No, the shockwave therapy.
The shockwave therapy. There's no evidence that that works generally, other than cold and sort of frozen little water bottles rolling on and getting smaller and smaller. And stretching that is really useful.
Sorry, just a question. How do you differentiate between Sever's disease and plantar on a junior athlete?
Two slides. But what I wanted to do first, so we'll do Sever's disease in the second. So I'll do some of the others, and this is some of the patterns. So plantar fasciitis is at the bottom. What I wanted to do was just show you. This is my yoga instructor.
Which class are you at?
Name's Abby. Sadly, she's online, and you'll see that very specifically, she's sitting in screaming toe pose. If you just email her, she'll send you pictures of herself. It's glamorous. So she's sitting in screaming toe, which is a really good stretch for that. Should kids do yoga? Positional stuff is really useful. Kids are often a bit flexible anyway, and we'll talk about hypermobility. But there's no harm in getting some of these poses. And screaming toe pose hurts like hell if you've just been for a run, but it's quite useful. It does stretch. And when I've had plantar fasciitis, I've used Abby clearly, and she helps a lot. But screaming toe pose is quite good. So the question was about some of the other things. So Sever's disease, and this is where they're all patterns. They've all got names. So that's your plantar fascia there, and your arch of your foot, and you get plantar fasciitis at the bottom. Sever's disease is because this Achilles tendon is tight at the back, and so that's where the Achilles tendon inserts at the back of the heel. So Sever's disease tends to come here, slightly further back towards the back of the heel, and that's where it's tender. Okay. Tendons are really stiff; they don't stretch. It's the muscle bits that stretch. Tendons are quite solid, so you can see that as tendon joins into this bone at the bottom, you'll get pain at the back, and that's Sever's disease. So that's Sever's plantar fasciitis. Generally, at the bottom, Sever's at the back of the heel, generally, and it will calcify again. If you take an X-ray of that, you will often see a little bit of calcium. I've got an X-ray of the shoulder.
So if you roll the ice bottle on the bottom of your ankle, is that then best to roll? You just the same thing with roll on the back.
Roll on the back,
Yeah.
and this is about stretching your calf and your muscles as well, isn't it? Yeah, because tendons tend to attach into muscles. If you stretch the muscles, this is where calf stretching is pretty good, because this will help. If you're stretching it in the first place, it'll help stop it, and when you get it, yes, you need to rest it and pull. Actually, look, there's my best picture. If you get this just below your knee, and you've got your kneecap, and then there's a little bump just below your kneecap, and then just on there, just below there, is where your kneecap tendon inserts, your patellar tendon inserts just on the top of the bone. Point tendinous there is exactly the same from overstretching and overuse, and that's got a name. That's called Osgood-Schlatter's disease. Okay, it's all the same thing. They've just got different names, but it's where it is. So you get it right again, right at the top, right where the tendons insert onto there, on top of there, and that's another one. Another one you get is swimmer's shoulders that you can get as well, and that's a lot to do with the rotator cuff, which is this bit, and in particular this insertion of this muscle that comes here, called the supraspinatus. And this is the shoulder. There's some ribs. That's your clavicle at the front. And if you can see that white blob there, that's calcium in the supraspinatus. And a very nice radiologist put a big needle in that and sucked it all out of my shoulder, because that's my X-ray. I didn't know. I took it off. I'm sure I'm allowed to get an X-ray now. But that's what it actually looks like when it's all calcified. Okay. And you can get that acutely as well from an acute injury, but often it is chronic. If it's pulled or you get a little tear, and then you keep using it, so you keep swimming on that, because of the rotator cuff is here, you'll quite often get that and it'll calcify. So you shouldn't be able to see that at all, that white blob there. And then that's going to take a long time, because that's almost bony. So it's going to take quite a long time to get rid of, a lot of physio and a lot of not using it and not putting a lot of pressure on. The other thing that you get with overuse that you hear about a lot from all the elite people is stress fracture. I think if you can just see there's tiny little fractures just there and there. And they're often, if you whack a bone and break it, it'll break in both sides. Stress fractures, just tiny little fractures there. And you can see these are away from the joint bits, they're completely away from the knee and the ankle bit, and they're in the middle, and they're really tender. And they get point tenderness of where they are. So that's where all the pattern sort of stuff's around ankles and joints and tendon insertions tend to be the sort of overused. But if you've got it away from that, in the middle of a bone, often your lower leg, then think of sort of stress fractures. The treatment's the same. The difference is, again, tendon injuries and insertion injuries tend to get pain early in the mornings when they get up, and it gets better as you use it. So those that have had plantar fasciitis know that as you sort of walk on it, it sort of gets better. Stress fractures, the pain gets worse when they exercise. They've got point tenderness, and like I say, it's sort of away from joints and growth plates. So that's sort of how you can tell the difference between those sorts of things. But they will get pain in sort of with stress fracture. It'll be the same sort of play. It'll be exactly the same place. You'll be able to pinpoint it quite nicely every time. The treatment, as I say, is both first. Because I'm a doctor, first, do no harm. I was listening to that in the book today. So the things that are bad early on, heat, alcohol, of course, obviously, not that they're drinking alcohol, running and massage. So all those things early on can make it worse just by giving you more inflammation. And if you carry on with inflammation, then it will continue to be worse. But what you should do is what we call now police, which is, this used to be rice and then people changed and now it's police. So P is protect, so protect it, rest it, don't put any pressure, don't exercise on it. You need to rest it. You can strap it a little bit. What you shouldn't do is strap it all completely. And that's because optimal, what's called the ONL is optimal loading. So a little bit of pressure through an injury is okay. So if you break your leg, if you remember not that long ago, if you broke your leg, you'd see people in big plaster casts for months on end. Now you see them all in those sort of walking casts. So actually putting a bit of pressure through it, supported pressure, actually makes the bone heal faster. Okay? But it's not stress pressure, it's not exercise pressure, it's not a lot of weight, it's just gentle movement. So that's called optimal loading. Ice, so early on cold is good, compression is good, and elevation. So that's quite early on treatment. Once you've got over the first few days or a week or so, then you can start alternating heat and things, and massage and heat. But acutely, you should avoid all those things. So if someone gets an acute injury, it should be this. It should be protected, a little bit of loading through it, cold compression and elevation. With painkillers, obviously, it's probably pretty good, just to stop any of that swelling. It's really useful for sort of overuse injuries. Just thinking a bit about nerves. See, so this is why I'm qualified to do this talk. This is my back. Not sure you can see it, but if you can see there, that's my L45 disc. So this is the disc, these are the bones, and this is the side, this is the spine here. Why it's just fluid on this. Basically what's happened is that disc has burst and squirted backwards into your spine, into L45, and it gives you sciatica, which I had only 2 years ago. Nothing to do with doing Race to the Stones. I've just done about 2 months before, which is a 100k run. Nothing to that at all, I'm sure. You get sciatica, and this is again sort of nerve pain is very specific. So sciatica, you get sort of buttock pain, come down the back of your calf and along the outside and bottom of your foot, and that's sort of very typical pain of where sciatic pain comes from. Femoral pain, if it's one of the other nerves, is often down this sort of central part and the middle part of your leg. So again, nerve pain is there all the time. It's worse with exercise. It's an obvious, really burning, sort of odd pain that you get with just the sensation part of that. There are some odd little things as well. So this one is there's a little nerve that just comes over the top of the bone here. It's called the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. It just comes over the top, and it sort of supplies the skin on this bit of your leg. And it's quite common in people who wear tight, low, when low jeans are really popular really tight low jeans. Quite a lot of people you get a numb patch here on the sort of anterolateral part of your leg, and that's just there because of this nerve. And if you just take the pressure off it, it'll get better. The other one you can do is one of the nerves comes around the outside of your knee, and if you press on that, so people who particularly do this, we were just talking about visiting my son in Newcastle. My 18-year-old's gone to university in Newcastle. People sometimes get up in the morning with foot drop because they've got drunk and they've laid on the sofa or bashed it on a thing. See, somebody else is nodding there. You can spot, can't you, to see who, oh yeah, I've had that one. Okay, so this little nerve comes down the outside of your knee, and if you compress it too much, so you know when you're completely unconscious on the sofa or on the side of the chair, then you can get foot drop from that as well. So sort of patterns of nerve injury. So that sort of nerves, they're less common, more common in old decrepit people. And Magnus tells me that disc there, which is like L5, S1 disc, is also, I think it's worked with roping. So I'm looking forward to, before he retires, having to do that one, I suspect.
What did you have done to that disc?
He just took it out and they fused
So you had a fuse?
it discets it and it fuses, yeah.
I had that fun next week.
It's all good.
L5S1.
Yeah, that was L45, so you've got L5S1. Yeah, so it's all good. Just sort of mention hypermobility. So a lot of kids are double jointed, very flexible, hypermobile. This is the ligaments which sort of hold bones together, they're not attached to muscle. So tendons tend to get muscle with a tendon into the bone, so your muscles are stretchy and the tendon bits are. Ligaments are just solid bits holding joints together. So your cruciate ligaments, particularly because the knee is quite a complicated bit. So as you're growing through adolescence and puberty, it all gets out of joint, and cruciate ligaments are the ones that can go. But younger kids are often quite hypermobile and quite flexible, often with smaller joints. But it can be their hips and knees, and you'll see that when they stand up, they tend, like you say, I can't even do it, but they stand backwards, so their knees actually go backwards when they stand up, or their arms will go down. They can do their thumbs and little fingers and bits as well. And if they're like that, particularly with their legs, if your knees are going backwards a little bit, or your ankles are a little bit too floppy, everything's just a bit harder to do. So running and things causes pain. And these are the kids that get proper, true growing pains, which is what a lot of people put down to any old aches and pains are just called growing pains. It's not. They quite often get growing pains. They're quite often either in the back or the front of the thighs or the back of their calves. They're fine, but after a busy day or an exercise day, they'll go to bed and they'll wake up an hour or two later complaining of pain and want massaging and rubbing and painkillers and hot water bottles, and you just think they're late putting it all on. Sadly, it's true. That is true growing pains, and it's often because their joints are just slightly out of line. Okay, the amount of force that you put through your knees straight down your legs, if your legs in plane, is massive, particularly when you're running. So if your knees are slightly in, out, backwards or forwards, and your ankles are slightly in or out, you can see if you lose the arch on your ankle, on your foot. So I've got the arch there. If I lose that arch, I'll tend to sit with my knees in a little bit, and therefore the weight is going down the outside of my knee rather than straight down the middle. And so that's why if you're slightly out of joint and slightly hypermobile and your knees are a little bit floppy, because your ligaments are a little bit floppy, that's why people get a lot of pains and growing pains, and they'll quite often complain of back pain as well, but often not at night. And the thing about this is these shouldn't be doing all the stretching and the yoga and things, just general warming up but not too stretchy. And just inline strength is really useful. So we advise not playing a bunch of triathletes here, so not doing football and tennis, is really good, because obviously if you're doing football and tennis then you tend to stop out of line, whereas running, cycling and swimming because it takes the weight off, but cycling and running tend to be in line, so they're quite good at strengthening, and you need to strengthen the muscles up around those floppy ligaments. And the other thing is that as they hit puberty they will often stiffen up, okay, which is why a lot of Olympic gymnasts are all pre-pubertal, and as soon as they hit puberty, their career at 14, 15 is over. And hence why in some places their puberty was delayed. In some of the previous Eastern Bloc countries used to try and delay puberty because they were much more flexible as gymnasts, particularly. But as they hit puberty, they'll start to stiffen up. And again, that can cause problems from if they're starting to stiffen up and they're used to being really flexible. So it's just watching that, and as they're stiffening up, it's starting to get them to then, stretch and warm up properly before they do other things. So that's just a bit about hypermobility. Okay.
Can I ask a question about kids that are the opposite of hypermobile?
Yeah.
They're really stiff. They
Yeah.
can barely touch their toes or get to their. Should you encourage stretching
Yeah.
in yoga? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds obvious, but sometimes you.
No, because they are just stiff. A lot of stiff from either not stretching and not stretching post doing something. So they do just tighten up and get stiff, and then just getting them stretched out is often quite. And they'll do it quite easily. It'll take me ages, but they'll do it quite easily.
Is it fair to say some kids have a degree of hypermobility? They start off knock-kneed and then they go leg-legged, eventually they'll come back to sort of inline, normal posture. That's quite normal, isn't it?
Yeah. And some will always be slightly knock-kneed, like you say, and end up, you can end up operating on them, but not until they've stopped growing. So their growth plates, all those little growth plates in the bones, and they all fuse at different. You can tell how old somebody is by doing X-rays and having a look. And the last one to fuse is in the top of your roof of your mouth, when you're about 24. Isn't that? But it means nothing. It's just some random piece of rubbish.
Just on that
Really
topic
Christmas
then.
quiz there.
Sorry, Christmas quiz. Yeah, we'll do a quiz at Christmas.
Just on that topic of stretching then, the sort of age of kids that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is there a kind of one size fits all of what our kids should be doing in terms of stretching, or does
No.
it depend on
It depends on
And
how
then
mobile
kids,
they are.
like-
If they're really flexible and mobile, no.
what
So if
sort
they're
of-
too mobile, it's going to cause them problem. If you stretch that,
yeah.
then that just makes them worse. So it just depends. There's nothing. It just depends on them really, and that's where you see all these. You see a lot of places where the kids are all got to do it all at the beginning. They're stretching and stuff like that. Actually, the flexible ones should be just warming up gently, not doing too much stretching.
Right.
And the stiff ones should be stretching more, and encouraged to stretch afterwards as well. There's nothing to say that stretching before or after is any better. As long as they're doing it generally.
What about rolling then, Steve?
Sorry?
Using rollers and stuff like that as well when you're doing your stretching and whatever else. Is that
Yeah.
beneficial?
The rollers just hit some of the sort of difficult stiff points,
Yeah.
and the rollers are probably quite good at. The idea getting them to roll properly is probably quite hard, because the idea is that you roll it onto the place that hurts the most, and then just leave it there for 30 seconds. Whilst you might enjoy it, depending on what they like, they might not. But yeah, that just sort of puts it onto a muscle and just relaxes that muscle over time.
So how then as a parent, so I'm thinking now,
Yeah.
I've got an 11-year-old boy,
Yeah.
he's not triathlete, he plays academy football, so he's playing
Yeah.
fairly intensively, and in recent weeks been complaining, got a bit of pain in my hip, my knees a bit achy.
Yeah.
I don't know whether he's flexible or not, but how do I know how flexible he is? How do I know where would I start?
Yeah, if when they stand, if you get them to stand up straight, then your knees should be almost slightly forward.
Yeah.
And you'll see that their legs sort of go backwards like that.
Right.
If you're standing completely up without any shoes on, you should still be able to put your fingers underneath the arch of his feet.
Right.
Yeah, and often, so if they're hypermobile, you see that they will flatten.
Right.
So they'll lose that arch completely, and they'll stand with their knees slightly back and their feet in slightly. And then it is just thinking about, particularly football and things. Like I said, they're out of line. They're going sideways. Their joints are all over the place. Knee injuries in football is massive at this sort of age because like I said, it's cruciate ligament type injuries that they get a lot of. That are quite difficult.
If you want to engage with the football, you get Maltesers. If you can get that under, that will get some buy-in.
Yeah.
With the Malteser underneath
If
the
you
arm.
get a Malteser into the arch,
Steve, our youngest is he's got Down syndrome. He's got hypermobility beyond what you'd imagine.
beyond any, yeah.
So, but one thing that was pointed out to us, if your children do have it, is that they have to work extremely hard just to walk normally.
It's a lot more effort.
They're thinking that they can do it normally, and then they've got to learn to almost walk straight.
Walk straight and walk in line. And strengthening, you see, is good because it gives them a bit more, sort of strengthening the muscles around those joints is useful. But yeah, no, in Down syndrome, he's quite often really hypermobile.
Yeah, we just look at him and think, how on earth have you done that?
One more thing about teenagers that I hate to do this because it's true, is sleep. So, you know, if you're reading a book at night and you suddenly go, "Ugh," or in front of the telly, that's when this is your melatonin secretion from your pineal gland in your brain. It just gradually builds up, and then suddenly it'll just flip, and that'll send you off to sleep. And that's that bit where you nod. Okay. This is a real study. It's not even made up. It's very secret. We don't put it out a lot. But the red line is adolescent melatonin, and it's about 2 to 3 hours later than mine and your melatonin. Okay? So teenagers and adolescents are not meant to go to sleep till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're not meant to get up until about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. So it's medically evidenced, and it's true. That teenagers their melatonin secretion is definitely delayed, so they don't have that sleep onset until sort of later on, and it is sort of the early hours of the morning. But then getting them up in the morning is more difficult, and so things like swimming in clubs at sort of 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning with the adolescents is not good.
So obviously a lot are in that boat, and a lot of kids are in that boat. Does that have any sort of physical repercussions because they get them up early, like 3-4 times a week?
No, it just affects their sleep-wake cycles, and they don't function very well. They don't perform as well because they're not meant to be getting. And there's a lot of evidence that all these schools that start at 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning, their exam results and things, so their functional results are a lot better. From a physical point of view, no, they won't like it, they won't enjoy it, and that's part of it. But they are meant to go to sleep later. I just put the other bit up there is blue LEDs. So the blue part to make white, you need red, green, and blue of LEDs, and it's the blue LEDs that also upset melatonin. So when they're on their phones late at night, it's the blue part of the LEDs. The guys that invented blue LEDs got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2019. I think they should have been shocked because they're keeping everybody awake. But anyway, so they got the Nobel Prize because you can then have proper white on LED white. But that's why phones as well stop you going to sleep, because they stop that melatonin. And they stop all the sleep-wake cycles so they don't feel as well, generally. And there's a lot of this. This is not just daily cyclical, this is seasonally cyclical as well. So this is where some people sort of get sad. They talk about getting seasonal, affective disorder where they work on sun lamps and things. I had a girl who was a competitive rower in the summer, and then she could hardly move in winter. She said, "I'm just completely done."
Should we be looking at long term when we're coaching kids or coming up with patterns of training to be moving things like swimming to the evening or the afternoon if it can? Would that be something beneficial?
I think generally beneficial is not early morning stuff. A lot of them don't do very well early morning, and they get demotivated, don't they, as well? If you'll get them up in their time.
Is there any truth that if they're in a growth spurt, they do tend to want to sleep more, or is that just?
They will need slightly more sleep. So they'll need 8 to 10 hours of sleep. And if they get less than that, they'll start to lose some of that sort of ability if that's chronic and regular. And that's why they sort of get worse during the school week, and then they're all right at the weekend, and then they start off on a Monday not too bad, and they gradually get worse again. And actually, if we move to more of letting some of these teenagers go to school at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, they'll be all right.
So as an example, some of our kids they're actually in the pool at 5 in the morning at the moment. So they should be going to sleep at like 7 at night.
Yeah.
Good luck. But they're not running something.
Yeah.
So we can speak to the swim clubs, don't we?
Can sleep patterns change? So can that be adjusted if you do it often enough, or will you train your body?
You can train your body
at a different time.
Yeah, but they will still tend to try. Their melatonin will still try and be later than yours. So you can train that. You can make yourself get up early and go to bed early, and get up later and stuff. And melatonin, you can buy melatonin. Okay.
Has to take melatonin without
He doesn't sleep at all. But what often you should be able to do with melatonin is you give melatonin at the same time every night.
Yes.
So it is just the replacement stuff. In America, you can buy it from a food store, 'cause it's like a food supplement, it's like a vitamin. In the UK, I have to sign special forms, and you can't get it unless someone like a paediatrician like me says I'm allowed to give it in the first place. But anyway, in America, you can buy it online. But you give it at the same time every day, and what you try and do is you try and get a sleep cycle in, so that when you stop it, then melatonin kicks in at that time. And then what you should be able to do in a lot of cases is give it for a couple of months, and then not give it. And I have something, I say what you can do a lot of the time. I knew, I have a lot of kids who are just on it. Yeah. And a lot of kids are on it quite a lot, but I do have quite a lot of kids who probably do 2 months of it every few months, because they just drift, their sleep cycle drifts, and then you get back into sleep cycle. So you can adjust it, but at adolescence and growth spurts and puberty, their melatonin will still try and kick in at that time if you let it go.
And I think I'm right in saying that even if you let them have lions at the weekend, same with adults, that actually is more harmful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because actually it's better to have a consistent time that you wake up every day, rather than having a lion at the weekend, which actually
Doing shift work is a known absolute nightmare, because it's all over the body. Yes, a lot of people say you should have the same sort of time. A big long lie-in every weekend is probably bad, but they should probably be getting up at 10 o'clock every day. But yeah, it is just something to think about. If, like you said, if they're in the pool at sort of 5 and 6 in the morning,
get them up at 5 every
Sorry, it's the effect on parents is the problem.
Yeah, that's it. Kids are fine, parents are grumpy.
2 hours before, so you've had 2 more.
I need a tranquilizer.
But other than them being grumpy about it, there's no other sort of long-term damage, is there? It's just
No, it's no long-term damage, but they just won't function, they won't perform, and they're not happy. They just generally, don't enjoy it. Okay. I'll just put this on. Just talk a bit about control, really, and just some things. Keith and I were talking about the effects of COVID and lockdown and everything. So I just got a couple of quick stories about some kids that I've seen over the past year or so. One lad was 11, and they planned prior to lockdown, they planned to move because he was going to move school. So they had arranged it all, changed jobs in the house and all that sort of stuff, and then lockdown happened and they moved anyway because they had to. So he moved to an area quite a long way away from where he'd been, still within the area, in lockdown when he wasn't at school. So he lost all his old friends, which he wasn't really seeing anyway, but of course he'd moved school, and he hadn't really got any new friends either, because they'd just moved and they had to. It was just one of those things. And he came in and he'd lost 4.5 kilos, he's an 11-year-old, he'd lost 4.5 kilos in 2 weeks of weight. And when I said, what have you had for breakfast? He said, I had breakfast. And his dad said, you had 1 piece of dry bread. And he said, no, I had lunch. And he said, yes, you had 2 pieces of salad. And he said, but I had lunch. And the only thing left in his life that he had to control was food. So he did. And he had no idea about this. This is not anorexia. This isn't one of those eating disorders that you see and all these sort of things. This poor lad, all he had left to control was eating, because there was nothing else in life, because he was doing his schoolwork, but he was remote, he had no friends, he wasn't going out, it was all horrible in lockdown, and the only thing left in his life that he really had control over was eating. So he did, he just controlled it. He had no idea that what he was doing at all. But that was just, he needed something to control. And the other story is a slightly older lad who was a cyclist, and he was quite a good cyclist. He was doing some, coming up with some trials, and with exercise, and one of the red flags obviously is collapse with exercise. It always makes you worry and think of cardiac things and heart problems. And this lad was collapsing on cycling training. So he was getting so far, and then he'd collapse and lose consciousness and fall off his bike. What he wasn't doing was he wasn't hurting himself falling off his bike, which was quite telling, really. He was also aware of what was going on, so he wasn't really losing consciousness, he wasn't really collapsing. And when I talked to him, it turned out as well that when he went out, his mum was tracking him on Strava. And when she rang him, because he'd stopped for more than 15 minutes, for a puncture stop at the same place that he'd stopped the last time we went for a bike ride for a puncture stop, which was just outside his girlfriend's house. And you get rung by your mum when you stopped at your girlfriend's house and you're supposed to be training, was not very good. And he probably wasn't going to make it into the team for the trials, and he was just controlling all that. But because his mum was controlling everything that he was doing, ringing him up when he was sneaking off to his girlfriend's for a quick half an hour, and his girlfriend's mum wasn't in, and his mum was finding out she was tracking him, and because the pressure of where he thought he wanted to be, and all his friends and all his teammates and the club people were all in the same sort of level, and they were all going for the time people would be in the team. It was all that talk, but that pressure clearly, subconsciously, was probably too much, and he was just voting by it, but he didn't know how to get out of it. Just how do you say, I don't want to do that anymore, or I can't do that anymore when you're in that sort of in that sort of culture and environment. So he was collapsing. I suggested he just sort of go on an incident detection and turn his Strava off. That was my purely medical advice. So his mum couldn't track him, and that might make him. And decide medically, we decided that I decided medically that he couldn't do. He had to take some rest from exercise for just long enough that it missed the trial period, and then he was a lot better. Because I'd said that I'd taken control. But control is really, really important for adolescents. They like to control, they need some sort of control. Talking about this sort of thing, you're doing triathlon and things, they need some control of that too. And so they will quite often, it's really hard to sort of see, isn't it, that when they are controlling or not, what will they do? They'll back off, they'll do something, they'll get injured, in inverted commas, or something, or they'll stop training, or they'll lose a bit of motivation and things. And some of that is really difficult, but it's something to watch out for. It's just control, and they need some control of something to do that and to carry on.
Certainly, we found with that sort of mental health and well-being, there was a lot more anxiety, self-harming, which wasn't necessarily cutting, and disordered eating disorders, just creeping out across the sort of talent programs, just because of that exact thing, because the focus, motivation, and the control, what could they control, and not everything else, which they couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to proms, they couldn't see their mates, all of that, I can control this, and it went through with many of them, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's not, COVID's made that worse, but it's still there, And lots of things, not just sport things. I see lots of kids, so like I said at the beginning, I do epilepsy, which is fits, faints and funny terms, really, and probably 60-70% of the kids that I see are these epilepsy seizures probably aren't, and a lot of certainly the adolescents and things are taking control and doing things. And none of it's conscious. I think that's the other bit that I spend a lot of time talking to parents about. I think it's probably quite a useful concept, is that it's not a conscious thing. They don't think, I know, I'm just going to do this or cut or do whatever it is. It's like the boy that wasn't eating. He had no idea about that at all. It's not on a conscious level. If I stop eating, I'll lose weight and then I've got some control over something. It's all very, very subconscious. Collapsing, all these things that you see. Certainly one of the schools in Portsmouth, we had, I think, 5 children in one class and we were all collapsing at different times. And none of it was epilepsy. But none of them had any idea that it was that they were just doing the same thing.
How do you enable a couple come through the club over the years? At least a couple come through the club over the years that have done exactly that.
Yeah.
And we've then investigated to the nth degree and nothing was ever found.
And it's quite hard. From my point of view, it's really difficult to say, I don't think this is a serious condition, particularly, if someone's coming collapsing with exercise and things. So your question was how?
Yes, so they have these control issues, and you can see it in kids. And I can think specifically of a situation within the club where I thought that makes more sense. That pattern seems to fit. There was no problem found, and it might simply be something along those lines. So how would we help in that situation? What could we do?
I think it's just about letting them take control of it and saying, okay, and that's quite difficult, isn't it? Because if you've got some kids who are talented and you think they want to do and they'll be good, but it is just letting them back off and come back as and when they want to. You know, and if they back out completely, they back out completely.
Give them space to do that.
Give them the space to do that, and then if they want to, you know, they'll often want to come back.
But even on a daily session, we can do that. You know, we can very easily sort of facilitate that. Thing. Say, oh, just go have a break, or do your own thing. Do you want to do something different, or you know, just to so it doesn't become a problem.
Yeah.
On Saturday, it was exactly like that. And just I'm tired. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be training. So we carry on on your bike, and they just chatted for an hour, riding their bikes around having a job, and they were still there and engaged, but I didn't feel it was the right thing to push them. We could have said they're good kids. They are good athletes, but it's not the right time to push them. You've got to back off and let them do their own thing. And then we'll come back to it. And
they'll come back when they enjoy it. You know, it's got to be. It's all about the fun, isn't it? You know?
It is.
And like that, just not pushing it really.
Just so I recognise it if it does happen, and then I'm a little bit less. You know, if you're going to join in with everybody else, say, oh no, actually, you know, it's okay.
Yeah.
And just handle it in a better way, maybe. So
So I think something Keith had mentioned was sort of safeguarding bits and things, and I think this is just in this sort of age group, thinking of adolescence is just a nightmare, because a change in what? A change in their attitude, a change in that they've just backed off. Is that a serious problem, or is that just them wanting a bit of control? Do they get pain with no performance effects? I should say that, shouldn't I? You know, different pains at different parts at different times, where they're just sort of complaining of different things each time, and it's just sort of changing, and it doesn't quite seem, but they're still performing at the same sort of level. Anybody with any of those injuries will back off their performance just a little bit, even if it's not much, it will be a little bit. Or they get different sort of injuries at different times. You know, so 1 week it's one thing, and 1 week it's another thing that makes you think. You know, things like we've talked about, the overuse injuries, stress fractures, severs, plantar fasciitis, they don't go away in a week. You know, they take ages and ages to go away. You know, especially if it's a bit longer. And like I said, some of those tendons have actually got bits of bony calcium in them, like that picture I showed you. That's going to take months for that to get reabsorbed and the bony bit to go away. And it's the bony bit that makes it really sore, particularly on in your plantar heel when you get pressure on it.
They never go away.
Sorry?
I've got friends of my age who've still got the remnants of osteoarthritis because they've still got calcium in their knees.
Yeah.
It sometimes never goes away. That's why you've got to be aggressive.
Always a bit of pain. Yeah. And I know very easily that I can still give you exactly where my sciatic pain is on some days. If I run just wrong or I cycle a bit hard or something, I can still give myself pain even though I've not got a disc in there anymore. So yeah, you know, that might not go away. So injuries that go away, you know, that seem like they ought not to, but go away really quickly, just make you think, you know, why, what's happening. Mood changes, they all have mood changes anyway, but more consistent mood changes. So always down. Vocabulary, some of the words some of the things they say are just a little bit different, and sometimes it's just different. You know, it's a bit like, oh, that's not what I expect from you. And the other thing, just as a non sort of safeguarding thing, but just to put in there is sort of back pain at night in particular. We talk about growing pains and things at night. The kids who complain of back pain at night, I just put that one in as a medical worry really. If they're sort of getting up at night saying my back hurts, that's something that we would see. And all these things are different depending on what you're used to. But back pain at night is something that we would see.
What does it sort of specifically sort of lead on to? What's the worry?
Back pain at night?
Yeah.
No, you'll give him a new
Sorry?
a new condition, don't tell him what it is.
It's just back pain at night is normally organic pain. So serious, you know, whereas we're talking thigh and growing pains are just achy pains and hypermobility type pains are achy pains. Back pain at night we would look at and start scanning your back to look for discs or spine lesions or things like that. Tumours even occasionally. Rarely, but we occasionally see those bony problems. So bone collapse problems and things like that. But yeah, it's just one of those sort of odd things. If kids are kind of getting up in the night with back pain, we would probably see them. So that was a quick blast through various bits of just things of patterns really. As I say, patterns of injury and things like that. Just to give you sort of an idea about the sorts of things that you see. But people have asked questions. But any questions? Anybody? Go.
Anything about ticking in kids of that age?
Ticks?
Ticking.
As As in ticks?
Physical ticks, as a neurological thing, and stuff I've read about it in relation to sort of depleting the magnesium in you. So I kind of read about magnesium after training.
Okay.
But also,
does that affect
had
ticks?
some problems with some like ticks that come and gone, which apparently is quite common in young boys.
So there's no evidence that magnesium has a role in ticks at all. So ticks are complex motor, just odd movements. Everybody happy to know what ticks are? Yeah. They tend to happen, particularly in boys, who like what they like, so slightly more rigid, Asperger, autistic type things. And somebody called Simon Baron-Cohen, who wrote a book about this, said that, of course, all men are autistic. It's just a line. All men are on it. Just depends where on the line we all are. You can put yourself. We could have like a big line. We could all go stand where we think we are, and then you could come and move us further. It'd just be like pushing us all on the line. So they say that all men, but they tend to come on at 5 or 6 years of age. They tend to be sort of motory things. They're quite complex. They often change and move. They're worse when they're tired. They're worse when they're stressed. They tend to wax and wane. They often settle in their teenage years or late teenage years.
And in relation to heavy training in sports?
Not necessarily, no.
Maybe just a tiredness.
It is probably just tiredness and stress and things. And again, it's linked to that. It might be linked to some of those that pressure type thing as well. And quite a lot of people that can be left with sort of blinks or odd tics. If they can be quite upset by them because they're quite obvious at school, particularly if they've got a bit of verbal grunt and things with it. And you can do things about it. Occasionally, you'll get someone slightly older with an acute onset tic disorder. So if you see someone who's not like that at all, and suddenly at the age of 10, 12, developed acute onset tics where they're going crazy with tics, that can be an infection or odd other things. Lyme disease is the classical one that everybody worries about. So if kids get acute onset tic disorders, I tend to see them. We tend to do their quick bloods and make sure there's nothing else, and then it will often settle down. They are debilitating. There are medications you can use if they're really, really bad. But I would bet the psychiatry type medicines, the side effects are horrible. So we try to avoid them at all possible costs. But yes, and they're generally not.
Exactly what you just said.
It's generally
all the
the
vacuum waves come and gone. They've been different. Sniffing, blinking, twitching, twiggling. They last for a while and then they've gone. But taking magnesium supplements has helped. It hasn't made them go away. As a kind of muscle relaxant or whatever it is. Or
No, I mean there's no medical association with it, but again, with anything, it doesn't really, if it works, it works. That's brilliant. That's fine.
Steve, is there anything you've not mentioned that would apply to kids that are quite tall for their age?
Very tall. Very tall.
How tall's TJ now? 6'3"?
6'3", yeah.
I mean, generally, if they are just normally tall, they will just tend to get hypermobility type problems, so back type problems, hip type problems.
Yeah, that's sort of their feet
going in
and stuff like that.
Inserts. I mean, medical conditions, occasionally see really tall kids with things like called Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome. Right. So people with Marfan syndrome tend to be extremely tall. They tend to have really long fingers, long arm spans. So your arm span should be about the same as your height, but longer arm spans than height. Occasionally they can have eye and heart problems with that as well. But generally, that's a familial problem. But generally tall kids often have sort of back problems and sort of the problems you see in hypermobility. And of course they run faster, don't they? Generally.
Just a general question around overtraining. Is there a thing of overtraining in children? Will they tell us when they want to stop? Because I've had my mother-in-law, she does too much. You're pushing him too hard. I'm not the one telling him to get up at that time. He's getting up and wanting to do it and everything else. Will they tell us?
They should tell you. I mean, overtraining in kids is similar to in adults. So you get just extra fatigue, you lose a little bit of performance. If you measure it, resting heart rate goes up, which is what it should in adults. and they can burn out from it. You know, they can just suddenly drop from it. They should probably have at least 1 to 2 days rest a week from training, which is really
where
hard.
they do nothing.
Where they do,
training,
yeah. You know, and you know, there's always that joke of what's active rest, and you know, it's a quick 10-mile jog, isn't it, or whatever. You know, well, active rest days, swimming day, or this day, or that day. You know.
We played with that with them because it's really difficult. So we call it a recovery day.
Yeah.
So rather than saying rest day, we think, oh, I can't do anything and they're stressed.
Yeah.
Let's give them a recovery day, which could be some Pilates or yoga or foam rolling, and actually put that in the program. They still think they're going to do something.
Yeah.
I don't know what.
Yeah.
On that one.
That's the sort of thing I think is fine, but it's just not doing that sort of endurance-y, stressy type thing. But it should be 1 or 2 days a week.
Yeah, so we're trying to fit 3 disciplines in.
Yeah, well, that's
over the week.
and they want to do 2.
The 3.
Change it to a 2-week or 10-day program.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
And just have like 1 long bike in 2 weeks and 1 long run in 2 weeks. Still doing it, but over a longer period.
Yeah.
It's quite easy to forget as a parent as well that they're doing, you know, rugby at school as well.
Yeah. They're doing all those things as well. Sport at school. But yeah, but it is. But actively putting in stuff like that is, you know, still feels like they're doing something. Because of course they're all your kids, and so you know, they're just as mad as you lot.
Steve, I was going to ask, when's it safe for them to start training again? Is there a guideline?
From injury,
Yeah.
when it's settling and stopping hurting, they should be able to start doing something low intensity again. But if it starts hurting again, stop again for a few more weeks. But some of this overuse stuff is going to be at least 6 to 8 weeks out, which is going to
Before
be
you can then
which is going to be hard.
So,
You know, I mean, swimming is generally outside of shoulder injury,
yeah.
you know, leg injury and stuff. Swimming is probably okay because it's quite, you know, there's no pressure. So swimming, if you're, you know, if they're desperate to do something, swimming is probably all right. Outside, like I said, about, you know, shoulder injuries, are probably not.
But the plantar is like horrible to try and get rid of.
Yeah,
As an adult, I don't know quite how bad it is for a kid.
It's the same.
Is it?
Yeah, it's going to be the same.
Probably
Because
be worse at school, wouldn't they?
Sorry?
Probably be worse at school.
Yeah.
If they can't, at least if you work in an office as an
Yeah.
adult.
I was just sat thinking, I've got plantar insoles in these from when I last had it. I haven't worn these for a while, since last year, and I put them on tonight for some reason. And these I've got you know, it feels like you've got a rolled up ball in your sock or something, but I've got these are plantar insoles. And
Yeah, I think it's really difficult sometimes with the safeguarding side of it. You see really pushy parents.
Yep.
And then you see the injuries that children get. We've seen it with somebody who's involved with our club, high elite end.
Yep.
And where do you go for these guys as coaches? I mean, I look after the welfare, so I look for Chapel now. But when do you reckon we get involved and start having those awkward conversations?
I think that's really hard, and basically not on your own, and that's talking to the rest of the other people and saying, what do you think? And if you think that somebody's doing that, it is just have a word. But sometimes you can do it, like, you know, you've all sort of said, you can do it with just the kids, can't you? You can just back them off a little bit and see what happens. But it is sometimes you do, you know, if you are seeing an injury, you're going to have to say, look, you know, they've got to rest. And
I've experienced that on numerous occasions in the club, but just to alleviate the fears you have, one of the first things Tony asks is anybody got any niggles? If somebody does, we talk to them. If we see them moving, I think every coach here is the same, we basically just stop them training straight away. If somebody's got a niggle or something, I think there's been parents here who have been approached, I've been approached by other coaches who said, Eva, it's not right, she's not training today. We don't let them train if they're injured. If they're limping or hobbling, parents can say what they like. I'm not going to coach a kid who's doing that.
I think it's quite easy when it's black and white like that. If they've got an ache, they've got a pain. It's when they turn up and they're just not quite engaged. It's those red flag signs, isn't it? When they're not engaging, they're not quite on it. Their training, the performance isn't what it should be. You just got to pick up on them really, really subtle little things.
They're the less physical ones. They're the more subtle. But I mean, the other obvious ones. I mean, you know, what you were talking about there. I mean, we literally stop it, and a lot of kids want to carry on. I mean, we've all experienced it.
Well, they get frustrated with things like plantar fasciitis, you know, because it feels better. You know, it's bad for a few weeks, they back off, and then they do a cross country at school or something, and it flares it all up again, and they don't want to stop because they're getting, you know, but it's really stop-start.
I think the other bit as well is, like you said, if it's pushing parents, the kids are just backing off, and I think it's a lot of it is about, just letting them back off a little bit when they're in. And sometimes saying, I think they're injured, you need to this is going to back off. And actually, saying, well, what's their goal? What is their goal? Maybe we have to rearrange that. I'm just trying to work with them, really, I think.
I think even push your parents, if you sit down and explain to them why having the rest is going to actually help the kid in the long run.
Yeah.
And that they will get back quicker. I mean, we've all experienced it. We've all been young and run through injuries, and we find that you end up being injured for longer. And through the experience, like yourself, I'm sure now, you get injured, you stop.
Yeah.
When you rest. When you can explain that to people through experience.
I often use examples of somebody breaks their arm, for instance, and you sit down with them, you sit down with the parents and say, look, this is an enforced rest, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't go swimming, you can't go when you can't get on your bike. And you just have to try and reinforce to them that when they come back, they will probably be better and stronger than when they went off. And 99% of the time, that's what will happen. The way to reflect on that is I think that they've been overtraining beforehand. They never have a time off. Swimmers it's now all the way through till spring. Then you're straight into the cross country in the beginning of the athletic season. Then you chuck in the triathlon season, and before you know it, you're straight back around. They need time off.
Triathlon is a really tricky one.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, the triathlon's not the tricky bit.
Yeah.
It's the fact that most of the kids, certainly when they get to a certain level, they're doing all those individual things as well as triathlons. So they're essentially doing 4 individual sports.
Do you have any advice on fueling? Because our son eats a lot. But he seems to need it. And if there's anything...
Wants to know where he puts it.
Yeah, I mean, if you put a padlock on the fridge, they'll learn to pick the padlock, right?
But any food groups that would really help him, because he does seem to need it.
No, and what I think is interesting, and I suspect will come out more, is about, carb loading's out. People are looking at slightly higher protein loading, so it depends when he's exercising and what sort of things he's doing. So there's a company in, digress a little bit, there's a company in America called Day 1 or Day 2, and the guy that ran it is a chunky marathon runner, and his wife, they ate together, and he was 50 pounds more than she was, and he couldn't work it out. And he couldn't work out why he was so, he just hit walls all the time trying to run marathons, and he thought he'd run marathons to lose weight. And he was doing all his carb loading stuff, and he couldn't work it out at all. And what he started to do was just to look at what he was doing and decide it was all crap, and he felt a lot better when he did other things. So he started avocado loading. So he'd load the night before on protein and avocado and have no carbohydrates. And then he'd get up and he can run a 3-hour marathon with no nutrition whatsoever. And they're looking, it's about £400, you could probably do it. You send a stool sample and they look at your sugar profiling. And if you're read about, obesity being caused by stool transplants, something you're not into, stool transplanting.
Start private practice out there.
There's probably money in that, Chad. And they're looking at that sort of thing and saying, well, for some people, and some of it's obviously sales, but they're looking at and saying, well, for some people, you eat that sort of long, low energy carb stuff, and it's not brilliant for them. They don't do well on it. So it's what everyone. Protein is probably pretty good. Higher protein is supposed to be good. Lower carb.
The timing of it as well, because what we're finding with some of the kids is they get up, they don't want a week of swimming.
Yeah.
They go swimming, they then have a liquid breakfast and not enough. They don't have time to graze, so they then got 5 hours. So although if you calculated over the day the amount of food they're taking in and the calorie taken, would probably be enough, but they haven't got enough.
They haven't got enough to start with them when they're doing it.
Training, and they haven't got enough for the next training. So they have a big meal at night.
And it's quite hard, isn't it, to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning?
Yeah, so it's the
Timing
timing
school
of it.
says when you can eat, doesn't it? That's
But they
when
think
you're
it's
hungry.
grazing, it's like 5 or 6 grazes they need.
Yeah.
And they can't synthesise, isn't it up until they've gone through puberty that they can't store it in the muscle?
Yeah, they don't do
they are going
glycogen
to
storage very
They
well.
can't store it until they've gone through puberty. And then
But it's,
Is that why they suddenly just go?
yeah, they suddenly go, they do that.
Oh,
and then they drop.
monosyllabic. And
that's
then
why they want Haribo.
Yeah.
Do you think they need multivitamins?
Sorry?
Do you think they need multivitamins, vitamin D?
If they're exercising, probably. Yeah, and nothing in particular. I mean, vitamin D, probably not, because I suspect, if you're out in the sun most of the time, whilst I've done triathlon, the only award I ever got was for the best bikie tan in the swimming pool in February, because I'm from up north, so I'm still in shorts now. Because I have got some long trousers somewhere, but mine are arse neck to cycle to work. So I'm still in shorts because I'm from up north and you have to. And so, so vitamin D generally is from the sun, and now, outside of summer when people aren't putting sun cream on, if you measure kids' vitamin D's in particular, and they did this in Scotland, vitamin D is quite low all summer, and then in September when they go back to school and stop wearing sun cream, their vitamin D goes up. So they're not getting sunlight. But if you're out and play sport and stuff outside, generally vitamin D is probably okay. But multivitamins certainly won't do them any harm. Whether if they're on a really good, if you're on a really good balanced diet, the answer is no. But again, studies looking at kids for anemia and iron levels in Newcastle in the north of England, they looked at kids across the board, and 25% of their healthy, posh kids, so kids from middle class and upper class families who are supposedly on a good balanced diet and not just eating McDonald's and Greggs, which is what they do up north, 25% of those, a quarter of those are iron deficient in school, preschool, young children. A quarter of those are iron deficient because the Western diet just isn't good enough.
And,
so yeah, all the kids under the age of 5 or 6 should have multivitamins.
Is it red meats and eggs to do your iron?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Things like that. So multivitamins won't do them any harm. Definitely. And multivitamins and iron are probably sensible. And once girls particularly hit puberty and periods, most girls, most women who have periods are on the edge of iron deficiency generally. It's really common to see sort of mildly iron deficiency. So yeah, certainly girls I would give my vitamins and iron.
Charlie had a question about COVID.
I don't know whether you've come across it with return to play or return to training with any kids that may have long COVID, if you've got any guidelines to follow.
Long COVID is probably the same as chronic fatigue type things, post-glandular fever, which is sort of one of the big ones. It's going to be a fairly similar type thing, and I think a lot of chronic fatigue is like that. Yeah. Last week there was a publication from NICE, who do all the big publications and all the guidelines for health, saying that sort of graded exercise is probably not useful. But actually, most of the kids that I've seen with it do really well. My advice to them is to, and the way that we used to get them going, we used to have physio that used to do this, was to say you feel fine, so you feel all right, so you go out for a 10k run instead of a 5k run, and then you're knackered. And then you sort of have a day off, and then you feel okay, so you go and do too much, and then you get knackered again. And so what they do is they sort of exercise where they feel okay, then they're rubbish, and then they feel a bit better, and then they're rubbish. And you just keep going up and down like this. And what I try and get them to do is to say, if I feel this good, do a little bit, and you feel a little bit better, and then do just a fraction more, and you feel a little bit better, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And just gradually do that. Instead of thinking, I feel really good today, I'm going to go out and do more, don't at all. It's really stepping it back and saying, and the physio that I used to work with in the QA, she left sadly. She had one lad who was a fit guy who had proper chronic fatigue. Presumably we didn't know what it was, but posed something. And he was doing he wanted to do his push-ups because he was like a teenage boy. And he just wanted to do that. And she got him doing one for a week. And that's his exercise for the first week was a push-up. And he was like, I feel better, and she's like, you're not doing any more than that, do one. And then the next week he did 2, and then the next week he did 3. And then he's doing 20 and 30 and 4. Do you know what I mean? But it was 1, and he was quite, I want to do more. And the answer was no, don't do more. Just take it really steady. And we all do it. We all feel good and do too much and then feel good. We do that. So we step, but you don't get better. Whereas what they need to do is to just really think about not pushing.
Yeah,
so even when they feel better, don't push it.
Think about the psychological insult if they're not going to achieve that and they go back downhill again.
Yeah.
And that's part of it, not just the physical aspects of chronic fatigue, it's the psychological insult that they then get because they don't think they're getting better.
Yeah, because they'll feel bad again. Because they'll go and they'll feel bad, but they'll try and say, well, I managed this yesterday and I can't do half that today because I feel shattered again. And it is just backing off it and doing it really slowly. And it is sort of quite objectively, but you were talking about giving definite things, definite goals.
Yeah.
You know, and also the other bit about it is looking at. It's a bit like watching your kids grow. You don't see them from one day to the next. I see some kids every 3 months. Holy cows! Like God, you've grown. And I told a boy who was up here on me yesterday. That I remember him when he was down here, which makes me feel really old because he's now big. He's on the ward. But if you know, you see it in steps. So you need to keep a diary. Is really good. So when you're doing your one push-up or your one thing, or you're walking 20 yards or whatever, and then 3 weeks later you're doing more, you can look back and say, that's where you were 3 weeks ago. Look how much you've got better. Whereas actually day to day you don't feel any different. You don't notice it. You know, you don't notice growing. You don't notice all those things. But actually, if you're keeping a diary saying, this is what you were like 3 to 4 weeks ago, this is where you are now, that's a massive improvement. Psychologically, that's really useful.
Yeah. We're going to put it on training peaks and just lock that diary. Thank you.
You mentioned overuse injuries in ankle, knee, shoulder. What about the hip areas? Do you see any crossfits, tendon injuries and things there?
Yeah, the hips are quite complicated. They don't move quite as much. They're more. You do move out and in, but they are more in line. You can get sort of deep tension injuries, but they're nothing specific. They are just sort of painful hip type movements. And again, it is just the same. You know, you're less likely to get that sort of tendon bony overuse. It's generally going to be down towards your knee area, but you can get them in your hip. And you can get some nasty diseases in your hip, you know, hip injury type things that you can get. But generally, it is just sort of pain in your hip. And again, it's just the same thing. It's just trying to stretch them gently.
Sudden onset of pain in the hip.
Yeah.
I think is the biggest worry.
The biggest worry is sudden onset, pain in the hip where they can't really walk.
That's the 12 and 13-year-old boys.
Yeah.
Something called slipped upper femoral epiphysis, which is where the growth plate slips, and another one is Perthes disease, which is where the head of the femur, the ball bits of the ball inside the joint, loses its blood supply. So sudden onset hip pain, I would say, is quite a worrying thing.
Sam's been complaining about it for a while, but it's gradual. It comes on, he's been running for like half an hour, and then it goes away when he's finished. But it's been happening for a bit. But usually just going to be rest.
Yeah, that's like to be overused rather than, like he's saying, you know, acute onset pain, sudden onset, pain and limp that's just there all the time.
Okay.
You know, but yeah, that sort of thing where, you know, again, is likely to be stretching. A lot of hip and back stuff is tightness around, so you're running abnormally.
Yeah.
Which I'm clearly now an expert on because my back's appalling, so I can tell you exactly where it is. In fact, I went last week, this hip was hurting, and it was this side that was the problem. This side was really stiff.
And be mindful that a joint problem somewhere down here may not, the cause of that may not be down there.
Yeah.
I know if I get Achilles tendinopathy, so a painful Achilles rather than Seaver's disease, it's not my Achilles that's causing the problem, it's my lumbar spine on the opposite side. Looks uncompensating.
Yeah.
So a pain in one place doesn't imply there isn't another problem somewhere else.
You have a few on, there's only so many hours in the week, and only so much they should be training in the week, them doing, like, cross-training, like doing different sports to complement what they're doing, or should you use all the available hours just concentrate on sport, your main sport?
No, cross-sport is definitely good. What you need to be aware of, I mean, if you're talking triathlon, they're doing it anyway.
Yeah.
You know, they're doing 3 anyway. What you need to be aware of is what we said, which is that they're doing lots all the time.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, if they stop and do something else, that's fine. You know, and we should probably, you know, the idea is we should probably all do that for a month, shouldn't we? We should all stop in October out of season and do something completely different. But we don't.
I think for most of the kids in the club that we have, they should be cross-trained, they should be doing a bit of everything. It's only when they get to 13 and 14 and they really are looking like they're good at one particular bit of it, let's say football or triathlon or swimming, that's the time to start isolating it down. But up to that point, they should do what they want to do and they should enjoy it.
And try them out. You know, try them, but as long as they're not trying them all, you know, all of them full tilt, which is what some people will. But, you know, as long as you know, watch them, make sure they're not doing that. That's all right.
Okay. 20 past 9 already.
Thank you, Steve.
Sorry?
Thank you, Steve. I hope that's been useful.
Yeah.
It's all the sort of stuff we've all seen, I think, on a weekly basis, but hopefully just gives you a little bit more insight into what to look out for. So, thank you, Steve.
Pleasure. Hope it was all right.
Thank you very much.
And if people want it, I'll try and organise similar sorts of things in the future. I don't know quite what's on, because he's doing all them, so I'm sure I can think of something. Yoga. Some of those topics are whole topics in their own right. So, if you wouldn't mind putting the chairs back, that'd be great. Yeah,
Where are they stacked?
just stacked over on the car park side.